You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 464 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I have a lot to cover, and I know the breaking news everywhere and the main focus, so many people's jobs and lives are being really impacted by the coronavirus and the reaction to it. That doesn't mean the war machine's stopping. And we have U.S. airstrikes going on in Iraq, and we have really important breaking news here at home on Chelsea Manning. Some dark news to start the week, but it definitely got better. So this will definitely, I think, be an important show to take the time to share. And you find it online at the Libertarian Institute. I am the news editor, and I write the daily news roundup. Both the roundup and the show can be found on the homepage libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. Show has its own podcast feed, and it's up everywhere people listen to podcasts. It's also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed, where you get, my show, Scott Horton's show, Free Man Beyond the Wall, and a lot of other great foreign policy and libertarian content. Lastly, you donate to the show over at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so the first thing I have on today's show is Chelsea Manning, who, as of March 12th, had served a full year in jail for refusing to testify in front of a grand jury. So I definitely covered this at least once a month, maybe a little bit more, over the past year on the show. So longtime listeners will definitely know this story. But in general details, Chelsea Manning was subpoenaed to testify in front of a grand jury as they were looking for evidence to use against Julian Assange in the espionage case they have against him. Chelsea Manning wouldn't have been entitled to, having an attorney present at this hearing or during her testimony, and would be other ways limited in her legal abilities and rights. And then, she felt she could put herself or Julian Assange in danger by, misremembering something or saying it incorrect. Manning also points out that at the time, what they're looking into is something that was extensively investigated when they initially had Chelsea Manning on trial and convicted her and sentenced her to 35 years. So, this whole thing is well flushed out and people know what happened. And yet they were trying to make her testify and she refuses, so they throw her in jail, which, seems absurd. Like, how can somebody compel you to speak? You have, First and Fifth Amendment rights. And yet that, that's what they tried to do for the past year. At times, her stay in jail has been in solitary confinement conditions, which is torturous, especially over the long period of time, deprived of human contact. Typically, you're kept in dehumanizing conditions, not given normal clothing, food to eat, people treating you like you're an actual person. She wasn't allowed access to reading materials or other, kind of personal information, like she wasn't even able to have a magazine on, that she was on the cover of. So terrible past year for Chelsea Manning. And then the darkest day, I guess, would be March 11th, just 2 days ago, as of the airing of this show, when she in some way attempted to kill her, according to her legal team. Now, this is, I believe, something that Chelsea Manning has had in her history. And so, while this is extremely sad, and I don't want to call it predictable, but when you put somebody who has a history of having difficulties in some way with mental illness in these extreme conditions that really harm and attack a person's mental capabilities, like, long-term solitary confinement, time in maximum security prisons, being dehumanized and treated poorly, well then, an attempt at suicide isn't exactly, there's high risk factors there. So, that's the sad thing. And it just shows how little justice there is within the U.S. justice system. So Chelsea Manning's time in jail this past year has been an effort by the court to get her to testify, to compel her to testify. They've also added on daily fines, I believe $1,000 a day. So, she's wrapped up several $100,000 worth of fines now. for her refusal to testify. And so what her legal team was working on was something called a Grumbles defense. Now, this Grumbles defense is part of, case law. I'm not exactly sure what you would call it because I'm not a lawyer. But essentially it goes that they could imprison you for not testifying as long as your imprisonment or some kind of punishment, I guess, would be enough to compel you to testify. So I guess Chelsea Manning's situation, the fact that she went as far as to try to kill herself, preferring to do that than testify, finally I got this judge to acknowledge her Grumbles defense and acknowledge that, the imprisonment would not get her to testify and has ordered her release. Now, I do know that people have been ordered released from jail and remain in jail for days, weeks, I'm sure there's horror stories of months and years, but I'm not sure when Chelsea Manning is getting out, the extent of injuries as far as her, effort to kill herself and, what the future looks like, but hopefully she will very soon not be behind bars, have some freedom, hopefully feel a hell of a lot more like a person and move on with her life in a positive direction. All right, the next important story I have is the U.S. carrying out airstrikes in Iraq against what they label Iranian-backed Shia militias. So this whole thing, I guess you could say, gets started, I believe on Monday in Iraq the 9th, when 2 American soldiers and 1 British soldier was killed in an Iraqi military base. And this is actually a base north of Baghdad. The soldiers were killed at the base when 18, I think you say, Kalashnikov rockets were fired at the base. No group immediately claimed responsibility for the attack. The U.S. and Iraqi governments initially said the attack happened but didn't identify who. And it's only been a fairly weak claim from the U.S. over the past couple of days that says, well, it's the Shia militias that did this, the Iranian-backed Shia militias, because in the past it's been the Iranian-backed Shia militias that have carried out this attack. Now, to start, I think that's fairly flawed reasoning, because if somebody who works at the Pentagon could reason that, I'm sure somebody, even some lone wolf or small group of ISIS fighters could also dream that same thing and put together these rockets that are fairly common around the Middle East and find a chance to launch them at a base. And, these attacks have happened several times over the past year, and in this case, kill some actual soldiers, whereas a lot of these attacks, although a U.S. contractor was killed at one point, have hit empty space or just wounded a few people. So if ISIS could see that, then maybe they would exploit that, because everybody knows the Islamic State hates Iran and the United States, and having your enemies fight together would be seemingly a strategically smart decision. So you would think the Pentagon would have to include that in their thinking about this, and if they're really just relying on that kind of, well, it's always been them in the past logic, then that's a real problem. Now, another problem with it is that in the past, it always hasn't been the Shia militias. Everybody said that I believe it's December 27th attack that killed the U.S. contractor near Iraqi Kurdistan was carried out by this Shia militia that is, tied and influenced by Iran, I believe Hezbollah. However, the New York Times had put this out, and analysts had put this out, that group, KH, its initials, actually doesn't operate in that area, and the Islamic State is fairly common in that area. And so we kind of see now the same thing that happened in Syria with Assad and chemical weapons, where they lied about the first one and they told a really big lie, and it convinced a lot of people in the mainstream media, and most of the politicians went along with it. So after that, all they had to say, well, a chemical weapons attack, and we know it was Assad because Assad's the only one that uses chemical weapons. They're kind of just saying this now. So the logic that it was an Iranian-backed Shia militia that was behind this, which isn't impossible, I will say. I mean, the way the political situations in Iraq, where the parliament has said that foreign forces need to leave, the U.S. is refusing to leave, so they're an occupying force. It's possible, even without the direction of Iran, that a group of Iraqi Shia nationalists go ahead and carry out some kind of attack on Americans that they see as occupiers. Now, the U.S. is in a interesting, very tense at times shooting conflict with the Iranians. And so it's not impossible that Iran is looking to push the U.S. out of Iraq through these attacks, although I have to say I'm skeptical on the timing if this was Iran, just because they're dealing with the coronavirus at home. And I would assume that picking a fight with the Americans and having to mobilize a lot of forces would only end up getting your army really, really sick at this point. And doesn't seem like a strategic time to pull this off. So who knows who's behind this attack? But the U.S. chose to react to it by carrying out airstrikes against what they say are several targets at this point. Earlier in the day on the 12th, that's the day these attacks happened, Trump gave authorization to Esper to, take whatever response that, he deemed necessary. I guess it's also worth pointing out that, at least to my knowledge, up until the time the strikes happened, the U.S., the Pentagon, hadn't actually publicly said that this was the Shia militias that were behind it. Again, they kind of hinted that, they have been behind it in the past, but there have been no definite claim that, we believe this is them. But obviously, the airstrikes prove that that's their consensus, the establishment's consensus at this point. The other major piece in this that maybe had it not been for the coronavirus could be a real scandal and problem for Donald Trump is that the House passed the Iran War Powers resolution that had previously been passed by the Senate, saying that Donald Trump cannot, I believe, use any funding to carry out attacks against Iran without congressional authorization. Now, as I've talked about this resolution in the past, while it kind of effectively works as a good thing, it shouldn't have to exist. The Constitution says you need a declaration of war, ensuring that you don't get to declare war. However, that's not the way it works anymore. And as we saw with the strike against Soleimani, the president could kind of order bombs wherever he wants them to go. And so maybe this should be a real scandal for Donald Trump to deal with right now. But I think with the coronavirus and, even if it is serious, I think, somewhat hysteria around that, this is unlikely to get a lot of media play or attention. From what I've heard, Trump's intention is to veto that War Powers resolution, which, again, is so absurd that apparently Congress needs 2/3 vote in each house override a presidential veto in order to prevent a war. But maybe that is the situation that we now face here in the U.S. So that's all I have on it. I'm not sure what the response will be from any groups, Iran, Iraq. Of course, in Iraq, you have a very complicated situation where there's really not a executive in the country right now. I believe both the caretaker prime minister and the formerly appointed prime minister have both resigned. And so if the parliament says that the U.S. has to go, what does the U.S. do with that? What does the Iraqi government and constitution, which of course was drafted by the U.S. just a few years ago, have to say about it? It's probably going to be a very chaotic time. All right, some updates on Afghanistan, where coming up on the second week of the peace deal, and it's not very peaceful in Afghanistan, but nobody actually, expected the peace deal to bring peace, I don't think, and very misleading for them to have called it that, but, that's the word everybody's using. Really, it's just an agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban. Maybe there has continued to be some kind of reduction in violence as compared to before the reduction in violence pact in the week leading up to the signing of this agreement 2 weeks ago. But overall, it seems like there's a fair amount of clashes between the Taliban and the Afghan government. It does seem like there's an overall reduction in violence, maybe between the U.S. and the Taliban, where it seems in the past 3 weeks there's maybe been one U.S. airstrike against Taliban positions. At least that's all I've read of. There could be more. I'm just unaware of that. But it generally does seem like that violence, which has been very high, especially in the past year under Trump, U.S. airstrikes against the Taliban has come down a little bit. Now we have statements from the assistant ambassador to the UN and then the head of CENTCOM, that's Central Command, General Kenneth McKenzie, saying that the Taliban is not doing enough to follow our goal along with the agreement, and therefore I guess the U.S. doesn't have to comply with whatever commitments they made to the deal, I think is the suggestion there. So it's not long into the deal that all the worst predictions are already coming true. Doesn't seem like the U.S. is all that serious or committed to the deal. It doesn't seem like the U.S. is serious about getting all their forces out, and the instability within Afghanistan, not only the Taliban, but also the Afghan government, where you have two presidents right now, both competing for, I guess, the right to call themselves the permanent president, is very problematic. Now, the guy who's kind of internationally recognized as president, and the guy, according to the election commission in Afghanistan, although he was the incumbent president, so seems like you probably got an advantage with, the political vote counters in the country. Ashraf Ghani issued a decree after his inauguration saying that he will release 1,500 Taliban prisoners. These are mostly old people and people whose sentences were about to be up over the coming weeks. I believe they're releasing a few dozen to 100 prisoners a day. And the Taliban say this isn't good enough because in the agreement signed between the U.S. and the Taliban, the U.S. pledged the Afghan government to release 5,000 prisoners. So not only are things a little tense still between the U.S. and the Taliban, with the U.S. carrying out airstrikes against the Taliban, it seems like the diplomacy or attempted diplomacy between the Taliban and the Afghan government is getting off on a very wrong foot. All right, a few stories about Africa here. In Somalia, the U.S. carried out a drone strike. They say they killed 5 members of the Al-Shabaab militia. The local people, including a member of parliament in Somalia, says no, you hit a minibus that was carrying 6 civilians. So this has been a pattern in Somalia that I've talked about on the show a lot, where there's not a lot of reporting going on in Somalia, and so we really just have AFRICOM coming out and saying, oh, we killed this many jihadists, this many Al-Shabaab in this attack, when in reality they may be killing civilians, and it's often not till later that we find out about it. Or never, I should say, if it's not, a member of parliament or somebody maybe connected to the victims, a lot of these people could just die unknown. It does seem like Air Wars is getting interested. This is a great organization that goes out and tries to really find the victims of the U.S. military interventions in the Middle East and actually hold the U.S. accountable. Maybe not to crimes, because the U.S. really doesn't have to deal with allegations of war crimes no matter how many civilians they kill. But at least in public perception, hold them accountable really at least a little bit to the damage that they're doing. All right, in Libya, we just had the UN saying again that weapons are continuing to pour into this country, despite the UN and all the countries in the UN agreeing to the arms embargo. And it's just like, this irony, right, that you have the UN, which is supposed to be this great diplomatic, international institution that prevents war. And they all say, yeah, we're going to have an arms embargo in Libya. But then, the U.S. allies, Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the UAE are supporting one side of the war, the same side of the war that Russia is supporting. France and Italy are supporting opposite sides of the war. So all these Security Council countries are well in on it. U.S. investigators are traveling to Sudan to help with the investigation into an assassination attempt on the prime minister. Apparently, the prime minister survived. I'm not really sure what the politics of this whole situation is, but U.S. investigators coming in always makes me think that, they may have a political interest, and I wouldn't immediately accept the outcomes that they put forward. The last thing I have up is the U.S. sanctions 2 officials in Zimbabwe. All right. Well, that's kind of what I got for foreign policy for the show. I hope people are, listening to the show still. I mean, I know there's so much going on right now with the coronavirus and that attracting most of the headlines, but at the same time, there's so much important stuff going on in the world of foreign policy with, not just the wars overseas, but the battles that we're fighting here, like Chelsea Manning in the UK for Julian Assange. And for that to get some attention too, even while the coronavirus hogs up most of the headlines. Also important to remember at times like this that there are people in the world who are on the receiving end of absolute humanitarian wars by the U.S. empire and their satellite states. That's, the Yemeni people with the U.S., UAE, Saudi Arabia-led war there. Look at, refugees in Syria where the U.S. and again, those countries and several others poured weapons in and prolonged a civil war there. Gaza, where essentially Israel runs an open-air refugee imprisonment camp where nearly 2 million people are in situations where without, imagine a massive flu outbreak, but, a bad flu outbreak like the coronavirus could, absolutely be devastating and wreak havoc. And, as I pointed out on the show, and as Ramsey Baroud wrote very importantly, is that with all the injuries and, kind of long-term recoveries of the people suffered as the Israeli military and snipers opened fire on crowds of protesters over the past couple of years, then, medical capacity there is fairly full already, and this outbreak is going to be hard to handle. Of course, Iran, Venezuela, and North Korea, kind of throw Cuba into that midst, countries that are very isolated by the U.S. And, while it may be the fault of the communist or otherwise theocratic governments of these countries that there is a lot of poverty, the U.S., sanctions and embargo absolutely makes it all that much more worse, and a lot more people will die because of it. All right, everyone, that's our wrap up. Hope you enjoyed the show this week. Make sure you share it. Foreign Policy Focus is on the Libertarian Institute. It's up everywhere people listen to podcasts. My friend Marko Marjanovic over at anti-empire.com frequently reprints the show on his site. I always post it up on my Twitter account at KYAAALE. The private Facebook group is Foreign Policy Focus. Donate to the show at Foreign Policy Focus on Patreon.